Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
And I am Eliot.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today we are going to be revisiting a topic we mentioned in passing on the last episode about exploration. We're going to be going more in depth about talking about the journey in D&D, travel in D&D and other role-playing games, how to make that an interesting part of the game itself, because I don't know about your guys' experience. Well, I know a little bit about your guys' experience because I've played in games with you, but in my experience, most of the games that I have played in and GM'd in, travel has had a particular mindset that is very similar to the way that we travel now in the United States. That being, we go to the destination or bust. There isn't really stopping for points of interest along the way. Hell, in the United States, the vast majority of our country is referred to as flyover states by like stereotypical New Yorkers and Californians. And I think this really plays into the way that we design travel in our games, by which I mean we don't design it. Travel doesn't just have to be something you skip over in order to get to the next adventure. I feel like there's enough evidence in the books of D&D and literally every other role-playing game that travel in and of itself should be an adventure. Like fucking Lord of the Rings, the foundational tome of the modern fantasy genre, is literally a story about travel from one place to another. Oregon Trail, one of the foundational video games in history, is entirely about getting from somewhere in Missouri, I don't remember where it is, to Oregon. And television shows like in the 50s, like Wagon Train was a big TV show about the West, where the people were traveling along, like from one place to another, heading west along the trail. And like the original pitch for Star Trek was Wagon Train to the Stars. So in all of this, I am contending that the only reason that we find travel boring now is because we really don't put enough thought into it to make it interesting, because that is not the experience that we have had growing up in the modern era, where 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago or more, travel was something that was dangerous, and it was an adventure in and of itself.
I think that you're definitely onto something there. But I think there's an extra factor as well, that's like the very modern factor of our pastimes today are much more engaging and dynamic than what the pastimes of people were in the 70s and 80s, when Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games first started turning travel into a big part of this tabletop experience. And last episode I mentioned the Avalon Hill outdoors survival game that was just a board game literally about the crunch of getting lost and running out of water and food and trying to find your way out. Like, that's all there was to that game, and they sold that game. Now I think that people expect a lot more excitement out of the stuff that they're playing, And I don't think that the Dungeons and Dragons specifically has done a good job innovating on the way that the travel part of the game works compared to all of the work that's been done to, like the skirmish combat mechanics and the spells and all that kind of stuff over the years. I just don't think it's kept up with the times.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say a lot of the same stuff in this episode, so I apologize ahead of time, but 100%, I mean, I think you nailed it in the intro. My theory is that, in the title itself, Dungeons and Dragons, and then going back to the early games, the early supplements and stuff, the first versions of the game that we've been playing through with Jordan in his wonderful OD&D campaign, where we're just plunging through some of the earliest stuff. The original game was conceived based off board games and tabletops, which are very discrete combat or encounter-oriented set pieces. And then, as the game evolved, travel just kind of has to happen. And I really feel like, the way that, RPGs have been designed or conceived of over the years has been if you think of it in terms of terminuses, you have a terminal, is one dungeon, and the next terminal is the next dungeon, and getting from point A to point B is simply a bunch of random encounters that are meaningless and meant to just kind of harass the party. But in the last campaign I ran, towards the end, I have a distaste for random encounters in general, and because I like every encounter that my party it runs into to be meaningful and integral to whatever overall storyline I'm trying to tell. And it kind of got to where you alluded to, Clayton, is that I eventually just quit, and I would put a little bit of time into thinking about where you guys were going to go, and then intentionally creating content for the journey. But it wasn't something that I ever really felt like I completely succeeded at. So I'm looking forward to this. Hopefully this will improve my DMing, this conversation.
Well, I want to say that random encounters are not the be all end all of ways in which to make the journey something interesting, to make it something more than just a description of going along a road or through the wilderness from point A to point B. There's a lot of things that can happen, and there's a lot of things that can be encountered not randomly, just because they are literally there on the map between those points, if you take the time to actually put them there. I think back at my early childhood in the 80s and in the 90s, early 90s, how we did our family vacations. My parents and my brother and I, we got in the car and we started making our way toward our destination as best as we knew how to get there. And if this was across multiple states, then practically the moment we crossed into a new state, we would have to pull over to a gas station or something similar, buy a map for that state, plot out our way through it, and basically plot our course from one state to another to our destination. And sometimes on those particularly stopping at rest stops and those sorts of things, there are always events books and location books of the interesting things in the state. And if you want to plan it out where you go to some interesting things that are in the state, you have those resources there, or we had those resources there to plot out a journey that had a bunch of waypoints along the way of interesting things to stop and do. And that can be a model for how you design a Dungeons and Dragons medieval fantasy journey, or it can be how you plan out the journey in a game like Traveler, where in Traveler your ship can only jump so far in order to make it to another solar system. You can't automatically jump from where you currently are to your final destination. You have to have waypoints along the way to stop and very often refuel your ship, and that takes time to refuel your ship, and that's where adventure can happen. So it doesn't have to be a random thing that all of these things that are interesting that happen along the way happen. It can be entirely methodical and planned out, and the DM just has to take the time to think about, well, what's the interesting things that we can do between here and there.
You hit the nail on the head. I'm sorry, Jordan. I'm going to jump in. I know I just talked, but that was the thing that I keep coming back to my mind is I think a good first step is to, if you take the point A to point B kind of thing that I talked about earlier, usually in most games, getting from point A to point B, like point A is like, where you're at now, it's important. And then like whatever quest you succeed at in point A leads you to point B. But I think a game that like focuses on travel as a content generating kind of thing, like if you can, like point B doesn't always have to be high stakes. Kind of like you said, I mean, your family took, vacation trips. And I mean, I'm sure that it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like you're trying to go quest to this point B. You're just going there because you want to, or you need to because of some money. I mean, it could be as simple as like Jesus and his family, paying taxes. You got to travel back to a certain place to pay your taxes, something very low stakes. And if you can make the point B low stakes, then as a DM, you can fill your content with the interesting things that happens along the way. And before I quit, most of the initial like level 1 modules, the modules that like start you off, I mean, most of the time they position you as, travelers to a location with a very mundane, you're carrying a convoy, or you're protecting a convoy going to this other place, a very like normal thing. And then something happens along the way. So travel in general should kind of always be that way.
Yeah, the stereotypical start of a D&D game is you meet in a tavern, but most often that tavern is also an inn. And why are you staying at an inn? Because you're not in your hometown. You are somewhere new. You're somewhere that you have to begin exploring, because that's one of the three pillars of the game is exploration. And most games start off, you have to explore your immediate environs at the very beginning of the game.
Yeah, and one thing you said last episode, Eliot, that struck me is that you were talking about your general distaste as a player for travel in games, and that you really just want to make it to the city and just relax and not worry about, rations and all that kind of shit, and random encounters or whatever. And I thought about that a lot. And I think that there's a role that the DM has for trying to convey to the players what their characters are going through and what the day-to-day stuff is like. That's hard to do in like a subtle way. But my read of a lot of this stuff, especially like the classic D&D things, this is something that's definitely swapped in like 5e and stuff, but we might be able to go into that later or not. But that's that being in cities is actually supposed to be more dangerous than being out in the wilderness, and more of a hassle, so like running around out in the woods is kind of supposed to be the fun part. That's where you're free. That's where, you don't have town guards breathing down your neck. You don't have, random thieves in the back alleys, or, scam artists, or, who knows what. And just like taxes and tariffs and all the random bullshit having to pay to stay every night at some inn. And the idea of a city is supposed to be both a place that you restock, but also a place that if you linger there, it will drain you of everything that you have. Like, everybody in the city is out to get the resources that you've hauled back from the dungeon or whatever. And when you're out there in the wilderness, you're pretty much the king of any hill that you can hold. That's just a long way of going about saying, like, I think that there's something that the DM should do to present the wilderness as a area of possibility, and high adventure a lot more than what often happens, rather than just like either something that you screen wipe and go to the next location, or this bookkeeping session that's just a fucking pain in the ass all the time. Does that make sense?
No, it does for sure. In listening to you talk, the first thing that comes to my mind is, and don't get me wrong, this was a really great encounter. I enjoyed it. But like if you look at your most recent session or your second most recent session in your game, I mean, maybe you planned it, maybe you didn't, but we found ourselves back out in the wilderness for reasons. And of course we get completely hoodwinked by, or that's not the right word, ambushed by 3 fucking, what was it, ice trolls or some shit like that. And the reason why I have a lot of distaste for travel encounters is because they're like high risk. I mean, in general, they're always high risk, low reward. And if you're playing a game, you just want to push the story forward. You want to find something meaningful, and just getting attacked by some random animals along the way just feels like it's just shit getting in your way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's why the old monster manuals had an entry in the monster stat block about the percentage chance that the monster is encountered in their lair. My understanding of what that means is that when you roll that monster on the random encounter table, you roll that, and if you roll under the 20% or whatever it is, that means that you ran into these ice trolls, within 100 yards or something of the cave entrance where their lair is, where most of their loot is going to be. And so sometimes, you find them far away and they're just out hunting or whatever. Sometimes you have wandered into their den and, whatever they happen to have had is, part of the loot that you can grab. But yeah, there's different treasure rewards listed depending on if you find a monster just kind of solo, wandering, or if you happen upon it in its nest or whatever it might be.
I mean, just listening to you say that, it put me to sleep. I mean, that's the thing. Like, I think that where a good conversation to have is about like the expectations of the player versus the DM, and like, what are we doing here with RPGs? Are we telling a story, or are we just playing a paper and pencil, video game?
This is, for one thing, that encounter was a random roll on a specific chart for that terrain and that area, and it happened to be that thing. That encounter occurred, and you guys, fought them and lived, and then you had kind of a choice. You could continue on whatever route you were already on and be like, oh man, that was weird. Or you could kind of grab that encounter and see where that thread leads. You guys could have backtracked. You found the tracks, easy to find in the snow of these things. You could have backtracked it, figured out where their lair was. I didn't even roll to see, how far you were from their lair, but I would have if you'd started looking. And then maybe you would have found a cave. Maybe you would have found some more stuff in there. Maybe you would have encountered some other shit along the way. Same thing happened in the most recent, where the most recent session where the frost giants were rolled. Also a random roll on the table. And again, you guys kind of discussed this, and I prepared myself for you guys possibly wanting to take revenge. So the way I handled this is that I made some perception rolls, and then you guys kind of detected that they were coming. You could feel their footsteps in the ground, and eventually could hear them before they came around the bend. And you guys were smart, and you dug into the snow-covered hillsides and kind of buried yourselves. And then when these 5 frost giants were walking through this pass where you guys had nowhere else to go, I had 10 targets there. I had the 7 player characters and I had 3 backpacks. And so I rolled a d10 to see which one might come under scrutiny. Turned out to be a backpack. I then rolled a perception kind of roll for the giant to see if he would notice. He did. So then he picks it up and he takes Chris's backpack, wanders off with it. They're not super smart, but they're not dumb either. But he picked up a thing and I decided that they were going to walk on. You guys might have followed them back to wherever they were going and then ambushed them. And then that would have been this whole other kind of, chapter of the thing. And that's an example of how these random things can create emergent story. It's not about the narrative that I set down even for the session. It's what's going to happen because of the choices that you guys make. You guys are making the story as much as I am.
And I also want to say about particularly the dichotomy between those two encounters, the ice trolls and the frost giants. The way the frost giant encounter played out, it did prompt us to think, hey, maybe there's more that we can do with this encounter. And I think that with the ice troll encounter, for whatever reason that didn't click in our minds, that we could have backtracked to a potential lair for them.
But why would we, though?
So maybe there is some degree of incumbency on the GM to telegraph some sort of information like that to players if that isn't an existing expectation in the campaign. And like in an old school game, there is this difference in expectation between the way the game is played and the way 5th edition is played now. So like if you were to throw something like that into a 5th edition game, there should probably be something a bit more heavy-handed on the part of the GM to let the players know, hey, this isn't just a random encounter, this is also an adventure hook.
Every encounter is an adventure hook. And whether or not it's like a detailed adventure hook or just like a short aside, that's really up for me and you all to kind of work out. It's just a radical sense of freedom. Like there's really no rails at all. And it should be, self-evident that these trolls came from somewhere. They live someplace, unless they're completely migratory creatures, which maybe they are, maybe they're not, but I happen to know that they're not. And, you guys are kind of figuring things out about the monsters, which is cool too. So maybe that's part of the motivation, that let's go back and find out what these things are like. Do they have, troll wives back in the cave? What are their children like? You guys were kind of discussing some of that stuff, and you guys probably weren't the first random wanderers that they ambushed. Maybe not. Who knows? But that's the idea, is just go explore and find out. And if you guys go so far off what I expected to happen, maybe I might say, well, I'll have to work that out for next session or whatever, and then create some content that went off in this random way. But, these are improvisational prompts that emerge out of the stuff that happens. That's the narrative purpose of them. It's not all just wear down the player characters and give an excuse to swing a sword at something.
I get that, but listen to you talk and just kind of like bubbling up some thoughts I've had for a long time now is that the problem with random encounters and everything you just described is that if you think about the narrative, and I know you don't like the idea of having a narrative, and I know that feels very like put you on rails and bullshit. But the problem is when you don't put the players on rails, it's like you have whatever story you have presented to the players, be it a module that you're running or something you've created for your own, it creates some gravity. There are certain storylines, certain plot hooks, whatever you want to call it, that have gravity, and the players want to go to it. And then when a random encounter kind of inserts itself, it creates a kind of like a adversarial gravity. that then wants to pull the party in a different direction that you as the DM did not plan for. And the next thing you know, you've got like 3 sessions of players plunging down some random, literally random thread that didn't exist. And that just diminishes the gravity of whatever narrative you were telling. If you're not telling a narrative, then fine. But I would argue that if your game lacks a cohesive through line narrative, then it just kind of becomes boring. And that's where I always like struggle with travel time, hiccups. Like if a player's going to run into I just would rather it be meaningful and add to the main thread, even if it's not realistic. I don't give a shit. I live in the real world every day. Like, I'm cool to have like a story.
And Eliot, literally everything you just said is exactly why I wanted to do this topic today, is because of that mindset that if it's not a part of this grand arc, then it's pointless. And that does not have to be the case. Whether you are using random encounters or whether you are using pre-planned encounters, going down a rabbit hole like that, I mean, it can be a lot of fun, and it doesn't have to be something that is just... There needs to be this shift in mindset where if you're going to the session and you end up spending 3 whole sessions, or you go to the adventure and you end up spending 3 whole sessions going down a rabbit hole, as long as it's a hell of a lot of fun, then it's not a waste of time.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
And that's why I wanted to have this topic, is how can we make that fun?
Ooh, that's a toughie.
Yeah, that's so there's a couple of different kinds of sources of fun in things like this. I guess we should probably address. So Eliot's talking about a kind of fun that, when unpacked, is probably well, you were saying it yourself. It's narrative weight. It's some kind of like meaning that drives this overarching story forward, and you feel like things are happening that are impactful on the characters and their development and all that sort of thing.
100%. I'm a very railroady DM. I'll admit it. There's
another kind of fun that is a little bit more like mechanical sorts of things, and it has to do with random or pseudo-random outcomes and a certain degree of challenge and, sometimes delayed gratification and a certain reward schedule of like dopamine hits. And you get that from, a combat mostly in D&D, where, you miss 2 times, hit on the third, and fuck yeah, sweet, killed the thing. That's that kind of fun. Are there any other kinds of fun that strike you guys as things that we might want to touch on here? Because when you say, let's make travel fun, what kind of fun are we talking about?
What I mean by fun is creating opportunities for the players to do something, because that is why we are playing the game. That's why we're playing these characters, is so that we can make decisions on their behalf and tell some sort of a story, whether that is a story that is on the rails and goes full speed ahead, or whether that is a story that is entirely emergent upon a completely random set of things that happen during the course of the characters' lives, and literally everything in between.
Yeah, 100% agree. The decision-making part is the part that makes the thing, the difference between stuff that you are doing and stuff that is happening to you. And if you're just doing something like, all right, we're making this 1,000-mile trek across this trackless wilderness, and we've got X amount of supplies, and we've got, so many days to do the thing, and then winter is going to come in, and then we got to worry about, how slow we're moving in the snow and whatever. And it's just that. You're just working out this, algebra problem of your survival. That's terrible. There's nothing, nobody pulled any levers there. Nobody turned the ship one way or the other. It's just, here's the march of inevitability. So that's why I think that
nobody wants to play the game where you get halfway to your destination and you run out of rations and you spend a session hunting for deer or whatever just to have sustenance. That's a shitty game, and I don't want to play that game.
I don't know if nobody wants to play that game. I will accept that you don't want to play that game.
Yeah, I don't want to play that game.
There are people that want to play that game, but that's a different thing.
Whenever I'm playing Apocalyptia, that is exactly what I'm expecting. Yeah,
for sure. There's a whole set of role-playing games that are all just post-apocalyptic survival kind of games that people play. But the thing I was going to say, though, was that, when you're dealing with like random weather, random terrain challenges, things like that, there's a little bit of decision. That came up a little in that last session where Justin was talking about, should I climb up to the mountaintop to blow the horn to try to summon the dragon? Well, it's super dangerous, blah, blah, blah. There's different stuff going on there. But the most interesting decisions come from interacting with intelligent or semi-intelligent entities that are, moving around in the world. So that's why I lean towards the random encounter table to make interesting things happen between point A and point B.
And if you're the type of DM who likes to plan out every encounter, the way you make a travel session fun is you design it like you're designing any other adventure. You decide how many sessions are you expecting for this to last, and you create the encounters that require you to that are the required parts to get to a satisfying conclusion, even if that satisfying conclusion is the city that's 300 miles away. Like, you don't design a dungeon where the player characters step in, like go down into the hole, and the first thing that they encounter is the big bad, and right behind them is the treasure that you're going to acquire down in the dungeon. You create a bunch of places in between the entrance and the big bad of the dungeon in order to make the whole thing fun. And creating a journey is literally the same thing, just done with different tools.
Now that I agree with. It's very consistent with Lord of the Rings, because if you look at the Fellowship, which, I know nobody wants to really admit it, but every Dungeons and Dragons campaign is trying to emulate in some way the Fellowship. And
yours might be.
Oh, well, yeah, okay, mine. Every game that I am very narrative driven. If I don't feel like my player character or my game, being the PC or the DM, is driving to a point, a end point, or at least like some sort of terminus that I can then, or terminal that I can then launch off with a new thread, then I don't know. I have a hard time buying in.
I think that one thing worth mentioning here is a difference in the inspirational source material between some of these things. So you're talking a lot about Lord of the Rings, which is a set story that takes place over, months maybe, of the main characters' lives. And they go from, Frodo being just kind of a nobody in this little town to being this big damn hero in the worst part of the world and saving everything, over the arc of these 3 books, right? And that is the kind of like boxed in structure of the epic hero's journey for one kind of campaign. There's another set of source material that is older than that, that is your pulp fantasy, like Conan sword and sorcery kind of stuff, where it's more in serial form. You get these like little short stories of, here's just, what happened at this random temple that Conan wandered into, or whatever the heroes are that you're talking about. It's not that every piece is building towards this, big climax of good versus evil or any such thing like that. It's this piece of this character's life, and this was what was going on for this week or whatever. And it doesn't have to turn into this, big cosmic thing, because the the thing that they're doing is the adventure, and that's who the characters are. They are adventurers. So it's just a different way.
I don't disagree with that. We're getting a little bit off the topic. I think we can all agree that travel needs to be fun. Agreed?
Absolutely.
Okay, so how can we make it fun?
All right, I want to break this into two parts. Hopefully this will not make the episode go so long that it goes into two parts. But I want to talk about how to do it for the two ends of the spectrum, a completely random encounter-driven game and a completely narrative on-rails style of game. Do you guys have a preference as to which we tackle first?
No, not really. What do you think?
I think the on-rails one is the easier one to deal with because it's so much more under control.
Does that mean you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think it's the easier one to talk about, probably.
Makes it simpler, too, because ultimately an on-rails campaign, even everything is planned, even travel. Like, am I wrong, Clayton?
Yes, absolutely. Literally everything that the player characters encounter has been thought up and designed before the session that the players start playing in this extreme that we are talking about now.
And that requires skill. Don't get me wrong, because you have to respect your players' autonomy. And so, I always go back to the Strahd game that I ran, but like imagine, I think it's Vallaki was a central city that most games revolve around in Strahd, and it has two exits. You have two directions, and so as a DM, you have to assume that you have to be prepared for both, and so that's kind of tricky.
Well, if you're running an on the rails game, then you're going to have the player characters you're either going to have the player characters decide, or you yourself are going to find a way to manipulate them into going to a particular place, one direction or the other. And there is a little bit of obfuscation that you can do as part of that any DM worth his salt is going to be doing. And that would be, in this on-rails game, create the encounters regardless of which direction they are going to go from the city. Have a series of encounters that are literally designed to eat up time of the session so that you can get to the end of the session, and then design your encounters from there forward once they get more toward whatever their actual destination is going to be. That is how I would run it if I was running an on-the-rails game. So if with your example of Vallaki, I would have maybe 3 or 4 encounters set that, regardless of whether they went to the east or went to the west, this sequence of 1, 2, 3 are the things that are going to happen to the player characters once they leave the city.
I would argue I guess I'm the token on the rails GM, which I don't feel like I completely am. As a player, I don't like to be on rails, but as a DM, I definitely like to put my players on rails. But that being said, it's not that hard. That we talk about it like it's this huge task, but like I'm thinking in terms of the 21st century. Say you're playing on Roll20, or if you're playing in live. It doesn't take that long to create an encounter that is meaningful, that's going to add to the players. Like, Jordan, you like to reference Robert E. Howard and the Conan stories that are all very discrete short stories that don't really have any connection. But I take more inspiration from, say, the Conan movie. And if you look at the Conan movie, if you think about like Conan gets freed from his slavery and then he gets chased by dogs. Well, that's a random encounter. So he's getting chased by a bunch of dogs, and, but there's a reason. He's being chased because he's a runaway slave. Well, what happens? They chase him into a dungeon, essentially, and after, entering the dungeon, he gets a magical sword, essentially, and that helps him all the way along the journey. And to me, that is the more interesting kind of model I like to take when I'm designing my games than just the discrete, unconnected stories that then in between, when they travel, you throw a bunch of random shit at them, and sometimes it pays off, sometimes it doesn't, but it always distracts from the main narrative, which, it annoys me. I'll just be honest.
I'm sorry, I missed something. How is Conan going down into the dungeon and getting his magic sword that he uses for the entire rest of the movie? How is that detracting from the main story?
No, it doesn't. What it does, it adds to the main story, but because the reason why I brought up the movie is because it's planned, it's scripted. You know what I mean? Why does Conan have this badass sword? Because he was chased by a bunch of dogs and he fell in the hole. You know, that seems like a random encounter, but it's actually not. It's very purposeful. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with rolling random encounters, but I'm just saying, like, do it the day before the session. And then, like, just roll your random encounters. It's like, if they go on this road, what are they going to meet? Oh, 3 trolls? Cool. How then, as a DM, though, I would challenge all DMs to just add a little spice. How can I tie this random encounter I just rolled to the overall story that makes these players feel like this isn't just a distraction. It's not a sidebar. It's something that's going to meaningfully add to their experience and help them achieve their overall goals, which, you know, that example in the movie did.
So, you, in your example, in a movie which has no random encounters, this was an entirely planned thing for the DM to present this challenge to the players and to force them to go down into this dungeon and do this mini little adventure. That's one type of encounter that you can plot out. Personally, whenever, like, in the game that I'm currently doing on Saturdays, it's a face-to-face game. It's literally been taking place since the last time we recorded. So I've had a lot of these ideas percolating in my mind that I'm integrating into this campaign. And so I've been thinking a lot about how many encounters do I want to have along a road? Do I want to have them on average? Like, do I want to try to have an encounter per day? Do I want to try to have it less frequently, more frequently? What types of encounters do I want to have during travel? And one thing that I've decided that I want to do for this campaign is more than half of the encounters that the player characters are going to have are not going to be combat encounters. And I've had a single session where I've been able to really test this out because the players were on the road. And I was using some random encounter tables from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. And I turned the encounter that was supposed to be a monster encounter into just an encounter with a weird thing along the side of the road. In the random encounter, I rolled that they encountered some hostile scarecrow monsters. Well, once I started setting up this encounter, I was like, you know what? I said half of all encounters are going to be non-combat. I am just going to have them encounter this group of scarecrows that look weird because they're posted up in a fallow field. They're just going to encounter these 5 scarecrows that are in this weird configuration, and they're not going to know why they're there. I'm going to come up. Well, I know one of the players in the campaign probably listens to this podcast, and at the time it looked like nothing. There was no information there, but after I rolled it and after the session, I started thinking of ways that I can make this a part of the story itself, and I have an answer to that. Why were those scarecrows there? Why is it going to be relevant later on in the campaign? So this is just because an encounter is rolled doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a fight. And I want to create a bunch of ideas for how can these non-combat encounters be? What can we do for non-combat encounters that don't require the characters, as soon as they see something, they immediately roll initiative? I would love to get your guys' thoughts on some ideas of what I can use in my games for non-combat encounters.
Well, the reaction table, I think, takes a lot of that, and because it takes a list of random monster encounters or whatever, and exponentially balloons it into a bunch of weird role-playing kind of scenarios. Because depending on whatever kind of modifiers that you decide to create on the for the table. Just to explain what I'm talking about here. Early D&D had reaction tables that you would roll as part of the random encounter thing, and it might be like, say, 2d6, and it would go from 2 to 12 on this table, and you'd have a range between like extremely hostile and very friendly, and a lot of gradations in between. Right in the middle is kind of indifferent, and then lean like friendly or unfriendly or whatever. And so you roll orcs on the table. You roll 12 orcs. You then roll the reaction roll of the orcs, and you get something leaning towards friendly, maybe, or maybe just curious, or something that's not like, maybe it's just suspicious. But that creates a situation where the players then have an interesting choice. Do they try to parlay? Do they try to get some information out of the orcs, to see what the orcs are getting bothered by at the moment? Do the orcs try to take a toll or something? Can you bribe your way around it? There's a lot of different angles of approaching it when you just don't go in expecting that everything is going to be this fight to the death, attack on sight kind of mentality.
I'm kind of the opposite. Random encounters, I've already spoke about that. I don't love them, but what I like to think about when I'm running a game is I create a bunch of mini encounters, and usually it's just in my prep. But like I use this one in particular that seems to be a crowd pleaser, and it just involves a party of players walking down a road, and they encounter a grizzled knight that's wearing very well worn armor or whatever, a very formidable opponent, but not for a group. And he just he doesn't parlay or whatever, he just sets to attacking, and then the party defeats him. And then after the party dispatches with this foe, they discover either, I usually do it with, he's got like a note pinned on his armor, but it could be in his pouch or whatever, and it's just a little note that says thank you for delivering me to the afterlife. My wife and kids are dead, and I have no purpose, and I'm seeking a valorous death. And what I've noticed is that when I run that encounter with people on the road, it's very cathartic. It's like, it's meaningful, it's dramatic, and it has this like punch at the end where all the players kind of stop and think like, oh, okay, that's kind of neat. And then they just go on with their life. Like an encounter doesn't necessarily have to be connected to the main story, but it just has to have a little. I think the players deserve a little drama. You know what I mean? It's not just a random encounter. It might be a random encounter on the dice, but it's meaningful. And I think that's all it takes. It's like, give it a little meaning, give it a little drama, and a little bit of thoughtfulness, and it can just really elevate an encounter that's just meant to fill time, but on the road.
So whenever I was coming up with the non-combat encounters that would happen along the road, I came up with several basically categories. We'll get more into this whenever we start talking specifically about creating a random table with encounters and stuff. But I have some categories of things that are non-combat encounters that you can have that can have meaning in the campaign. Whenever you're walking along a road, everybody is everyone is traveling at walking pace. Even carts are going basically at walking pace, because even though beasts of burden can go faster, there's usually a person walking along with them. So you're more likely to encounter people, either you will come upon them traveling the other direction, and so they might have information about the place the player characters are going, either their final destination or maybe just one of the waypoints along the way, that they might be able to go ahead and tell the player characters, that like this is how people acted in the Middle Ages. They would stop and talk with whoever they met along the road to get information about the road ahead. So this might be, oh, the bridge ahead is out. We had to go 3 miles upstream to find a place to ford, or something like that. Or it could be giving information about potential like encounters that are happening. Like, you encounter a group of merchants, and they say, oh, we got robbed 3 miles back, so be on the lookout. Or other people you could encounter could be like pilgrims on a pilgrimage to a particular holy site. Or they could be traveling on their way back from a holy site. Either way, giving information either about the world or about what lies on the road ahead. Other encounters that I had thought of are like you're encountering some sort of agent of the local authority. Like Robin Hood stories are rife with the merry men accosting agents of the Sheriff of Nottingham while he is transporting tax revenue or something like that. So these are the types of people that you could encounter along the roads. Other things that I had were like Rome built its roads for the military, and that's why modern U.S. and European interstates exist, is for military transport. That's their primary function. So that's another thing you can encounter along the road, and that can give you a wealth of information about what's going on in the greater world if you're encountering a military squad either on their way to or on their way back from a battle. So that's some of the information that I thought would be something cool that could be a non-combat encounter for players to have in a game.
Yeah, for sure. Like one of my favorite encounters that is on the Strahd random encounters is a random tea set that's set up along the road. You know, there's some evidence of some horrible thing, but mainly just the players get a tea set and they don't know why. And stuff like that, you know, if you're a DM, it's, you know, it gives you a pause to slow the game down a little bit. But it also gives you a future hook. That kind of stuff I think is, you know, very interesting.
I'm confused because I would have figured that would be the kind of encounter that you would not like because it doesn't immediately have anything to do with what's going on. You know, like it's clearly not part of a bigger thread and would require some work on the DM's part to weave it into, you know, whatever else is going on and put some meaning to it. It's there as like just a what the fuck kind of, you know, momentary head fuck kind of thing, right? Like it's a head scratcher on purpose just to demonstrate how weird Barovia is.
No, I dig that because of what it does as a DM. If you're in the DM's chair and you roll that and you put it in your game, what it does, it allows you to create a thread. If you want to, you can. If you don't, then it's just a mystery. But it keeps the players thinking. It's beyond like, oh, we got attacked by some goblins. We killed them. Great. We went back to their lair. We killed them too. We took their treasure. And then we went back to the storyline. But stuff like that, you know, who knows, 5, 6, 10 sessions later, they might run into a prince or a particularly important NPC and need a good deal or need something from them. Lo and behold, you know, they lost their daughter or they lost their tea set along the way and you return it to them. It gives you creative ammunition. Does that make sense? And if you don't follow up on it, then it just adds to the realism of the game. It creates depth, you know. That's my main thing. It's not even so much that random encounters aren't meaningful. It's that they don't add to the depth and immersion and enrichness of the game. But if you can create a random encounter that does that, then have at it. You know, have as many as you want.
That's exactly what I've been saying the whole time. A nest of goblins is, you know, just a nest of goblins. Just like a random tea set is just a random tea set, unless something else, you know, kind of has some kind of meaning to it. It's one way or the other. It's on the DM to either add some more stuff there or not. You know, not everything I think has to have some built-in, you know, reference back to something else. And as I recall, when we found that tea set in Barovia, the consensus was, That's weird. we looked around for other things to tie it to anything, and it's just this weird fucking glitch in the matrix or whatever. I don't even remember if we took it.
With it.
I don't even remember if we took it with us. Did we?
I never followed up.
Yeah,
you did, but I never followed up, and it got lost in your inventory. But it was an option for me as a DM, because most random encounters are just, in my opinion, in my experience, random encounters are just filler, like an opportunity for the DM to slow the game down, present an obstacle for the players, but it mainly just kind of keeps them from getting to the end of their material before the game's over. And go ahead.
I was just gonna say that we've been talking a lot about random encounters as something that is occurring kind of at playtime, but there's a lot of instances where I've seen of random encounters being suggested as just being there as narrative construction prompts for when a DM is doing their work to put a session together. And maybe the DM sits there and rolls 4 or 5 times on a random encounter table until they find something that they like, because they don't know exactly what they want to happen, but they know they want something to happen between these two spots. And so let's partially leave it to fate, and with some kind of veto power on the part of the DM.
That's an excellent point, and I do that. I will, like, between sessions, I will do a random encounter roll, and whatever the result is, I will design that as the encounter that happens, and I will go and I will put the mental work in order to make it quote relevant, in the way that Eliot has been talking about this entire time. So you, just because something is random doesn't mean you leave it devoid of all meaning. You can do an entirely random campaign. It's a hell of a lot of work to do, but you can do an entirely random campaign where everything does tie in together in one way or another.
100%. That's all I've been saying this whole podcast, is that I have no problem with random encounters. They have a really important place for a DM, because being a DM is hard work. So at some point you have to get a little help from a random roll or whatever. But once you make that random roll, if you do it like a couple days before the session, like zhuzh it up a little bit, like give it a little bit of spice, like take an extra step and connect it to what the players have been doing. It's not even about railroading. It's about like making it meaningful, because I know the real world, if you were in a medieval setting, you're on the road in the dark, you're going to get attacked by wolves. Like it's going to happen. But I'm not playing a reality simulator. I'm playing I'm pursuing a goal. So like, help me pursue my goal, is all I'm asking.
That I think is a matter of taste, and that's a place where we differ, because like, to me, those random things, it reinforces to me this perception that the world is a living, breathing place, and there's stuff going on, creatures and people and whatever wandering around out there in this narrative idea that we've created, this fake world that we're all pretending is real. And it's not all just conveniently connected to all the same shit that I've been interacting with the whole time. Like if every single goblin that I come across is a servant of the same dark lord that, I'm fighting against, and it's always just one more convenient, piece of info in his pocket, that is asking more of my suspension of disbelief than in something like Skyrim or whatever, where you've got a bunch of different stories that you could be participating in. And meanwhile, there's just an ecosystem that exists just out in the wilderness that may or may not know anything at all about what you're concerned about on your quest arc,
And that's the argument I would make, that's why RPGs are difficult. Like, being a DM is difficult, dude. Like, props to you. You ran for like a year and a half. Like, I ran Strahd for maybe 12 months, 13 months, and it was fucking hard. But, the reality is, like, I'm playing these games to have a meaningful. If I want to play a reality simulator, I'm just going to live my life.
It's not a reality simulator. It's a fantasy world simulator. Is what I'm saying. It's not like someone's coming around, telling you need to pay a parking ticket.
No, I get that. Like, I get it. If you go wandering off into the mountains of snow, yeah, you're probably going to run into some trolls. I mean, that's completely understandable. I don't know. I don't know how to articulate the way I feel, but like, I just, I don't play D&D to. I mean, here's one thing. If you think about Skyrim, you made your analogy Skyrim. I've played a hell of a lot of Skyrim. I've maybe invested 50 hours of my life, maybe more, definitely less than 100 in Skyrim. How many sessions have you ran in your current OD&D game?
We just passed 52.
All right, so 52 times 4, is like over 250. It's 200, between 200 and 250 hours. I've invested 200 and plus hours of my life in that game. That's a hell of a lot more than a video game, Like, I'm looking for something different. Like, if I wanted just Skyrim, I would just play Skyrim. Does that make sense?
I'm not clear on what kind of game that you are looking for, I guess, is what I'm puzzled by. You and I haven't role played together in many years prior to when you started running.
Far too long, dude. The last game was Clayton.
Well, prior to when you started running Strahd, I think, is the first time that we role play together in years and years, right?
100%, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know what kind of games tickle your fancy, really. But, sorry to break it to you. I'm running an old school AD&D game, and that's that's the experience we're having.
Shit, really?
Yeah.
Don't take this as
that's what's going on here.
Please don't. I'm enjoying your game. I make it every chance I get. I hope it makes it to like 500 sessions for all I care. Like, I'm enjoying it, but I'm just kind of like talking to the point that when we're traveling, you have two choices. If you are a DM and you have a party traveling, you can create a random encounter that is essentially meaningless to the overall story, or you thread it back in. And I mean, I'm just of the opinion that if you're a player in a game, ultimately you want to be given an overall task, and you want to be given an opportunity to accomplish it. And anything that doesn't get you in that direction just really feels like bullshit. I mean, am I being too harsh?
So you guys have in this game this largely taking a cue from things like Skyrim and Fallout and other role-playing games. You guys have a shared document that is the quest log, essentially, for the group. I'm looking at it right now, and I'm counting 8 different quest threads that you guys are aware of and have kind of looked into in varying degrees. What there is not in my game is, unlike in Skyrim and Fallout and whatever, there is not one main quest thread. Everything is a set of options that some of them actually kind of weave together and turn out to be part of an intertwined situation somewhere. Some of them have nothing to do with each other. And the story that you're wanting to have like rolled out in front of you like a red carpet doesn't exist. What exists is a bunch of opportunities for adventure. And the story of the game is what the group decides to pursue. And that's not up to me.
Bullshit. I'm sorry. I sneezed.
How is that bullshit? That's literally what we're doing.
We can talk about this off the pod. I don't want to make this a referendum on your game because I'm enjoying it. I'm loving it. I don't want to paint a difficult picture. I'm using it as the example because that's the example. I mean, it's the only game I'm playing in right now. I'm not running anything. That was just the example that came to mind. But, being the topic is that how to make travel interesting, my only my main feedback is that travel when you're going from point A to point B, where point A was important and you've accomplished that, and point B is the next place you want to go, that's very important to you and the party. Anything that hinders you along the way, if it's not meaningful to that, I mean, it just feels like the DM is throwing confetti at you to slow the pace down so that you don't outpace their story. And that is something I've ran into with just about every game I've ever played, and it's very routine. Like when that happens, I'm like, oh, here's the bullshit part. The DM doesn't have material after this, so okay, we're gonna just slog through this random encounter. We're gonna get some loot, whatever, but I'll probably forget about this encounter in like 2 sessions. Does that make sense?
So let me throw this. Hang on. Let me just try to throw this out there. What you're saying makes perfect sense to me. If the type of story is we take the ring to Mount Doom to stick it to the Dark Lord, right? What if the story is instead we are trying to find the Northwest Passage, or we are trying to find this, rumored island out in the ocean, or the city of gold out in the jungle, something like that. Then would you feel the same way that, these random things that occurring are just time wasters? Or would you think then that, well, that's part of the exploration. That's what we're doing.
No, that's totally cool with me. Like in a perfect world, in this exploration game you've kind of painted, random encounters are going to add to the richness of the world. It's like, oh shit, I didn't know that trolls existed here. I guess I know now. Or, if along the way I learn something about the setting, I learn something interesting or useful, I guess useful is the better word. If I learn something useful about the world the DM is trying to present to me, that probably, and as a DM, every encounter is not going to be meaningful because you do need those time fillers. But once you are doing your post-mortem of your game, you use that to thread it into something else in the story you're trying to tell. Because, me personally, I'm a very narrative-driven DM. If I'm not telling a story, I don't know why I'm doing this. Because, again, the DM has so much more work to do than everybody else. And so, like, if I'm not telling a story through my game, then I'm not going to run that game very long. Does that make sense? So it's like, random encounters are fine. But, like, if you can use, looking back on it, if you can thread it in so it can lead you into something else, it's better. I mean, it's just it feels better as a PC, is all I'm saying.
All right, let's talk about how to make random encounters actually good, actually fun, something that are engaging, and something that makes travel worth doing, makes travel fun.
Foreshadowing. That would be my first word that I'll start this conversation with. Like when the players leave from point A to go to point B, they're not just blindsided. Like they know that travel is dangerous, or they know they have something, there's some high stakes getting from point A to point B. So even if it is just they get randomly assailed, they give a shit. It's not just their personal safety or whatever. I mean, that's important, but there's a reason why they're getting from point A to point B.
So a random campaign requires so much more prep than a campaign that has every single story beat planned out ahead of time. You have to create the random encounter tables. You have to decide what's going to be on them. You have to figure out the probability at which random encounters will happen. You have to take into account what type of game you're going to be playing to come to that conclusion. Jordan, your Apocalyptia game it's the most intensive exercise I have personally seen in coming up with
it's crunchy.
All of that information and putting it into a format where it is easily accessible. I want to give you huge kudos for all of the work that you put into that system. God damn, man.
Thanks, man.
No, legit. Anybody who hasn't actually gone out and downloaded those books, they're legit. Like, it's good shit. Like, anybody who listens to this podcast, if you don't have Apocalyptia on your computer, what's fucking wrong?
It's available on drive2rpg.com. Pay what you want.
So, Jordan, what did you decide as whenever I create random encounters or random encounter tables, I create different categories for the types of encounters that are going to go on there. So I like to have nested tables. I will have an overarching table that has categories like hostile encounter, helpful encounter, neutral encounter, landmark, environmental hazard, and then those will refer to other tables where the hostile encounter table will be keyed to, D&D does it. They do it by biome, where all of the different types of things that would live in a forest would be on the forest encounter table. How do you go about creating those types of tables?
So since I'm running Greyhawk, I'm using the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide random encounter table, and in the first Greyhawk campaign setting book, it's the second one. There is random encounters by kingdom, so I'm using those as well. And within these, that kind of gets you into a biome, kind of, but there's a few kingdoms, like Blackmoor, for instance, has a couple of different kinds of areas. So we've got kind of like the overarching one of Blackmoor, but then sort of within that, there's, the mountainous regions, the swampy regions is a bunch of it. There's a little part of it that's semi-desert, like more like steppe land kind of stuff, and then there's the ocean, like coastal kind of areas around the icy sea. That's sort of a different set too. And I've been kind of fiddling and developing those, as I go. And then there's also kind of a seasonal element that I've been messing around with lately, because Blackmoor is essentially Alaska for Greyhawk, and so during the winter, it really cuts down on the likelihood of you seeing like human merchants, wandering around, because there's snow up to people's waists. There's that'll change as time goes on and things get warmer or whatever. But I like to kind of like it's a constant work in progress. I don't have any random encounters that are set in stone. I'm kind of messing with it live and just trying to think of like, what is the current state of the random encounter table for the area that you guys are in? You know what I mean?
So what's the frequency at which encounters happen, or at which they're rolled? How often do you roll for them, and what would be considered a roll that would spawn an encounter? So
I'm not using the old school method of doing it exactly. The old school method had like this hex crawl thing, and you'd move across hexes depending on what the hex size is, but maybe like one hex a day. If it's like 30-mile hexes, roughly 30 miles a day of like hard marching is kind of the assumption, and then you'd roll, and maybe it's a 1 in 6 chance, maybe it's a 2 in 6 chance that you encounter something significant. I'm not doing that. I'm doing something a little different, where I will roll a d6, and that is how many days of travel you guys have until you encounter a thing. And so if you're just going, one day over to the next town in the next valley, you very well might not encounter anything. But if you're going across the duchy or barony or whatever it is you're in, it's inevitable that you're going to run into something. So that's how I do it. And then from there, I roll on the tables that I'm messing with. And I've been using the reaction tables like I was talking about before. And I'm starting to play around with some of the things like you're talking about, Clayton, with things like geographic features and like other like points of interest. But Blackmoor is so dense with that kind of stuff that, I guess I'd rather just present it as it is there, rather than it just kind of like randomly occurring. I don't know. I'm going back and forth on that piece.
Jordan, thank you very much, because for some reason it just never fucking occurred to me to do um to make a roll to see how many time increments until the next random encounter, because I've always been doing it of like, if there's three rolls per day, then I will roll three times to see if a certain number comes up on a die to see whether or not an encounter happens.
That's way too much.
Yeah. Thank you very much for saying that. I'm definitely going to be using that from here on out.
There is a place for random encounters to be a consequence of players dithering. I will agree with that. Like, if you have a party, kind of like you do, Jordan, who really loves to dither and argue and not come to consensus, then I'm fully on board with a random encounter just being a cattle prod to, like, wake the fuck up, guys. You've sat here and talked for hours about some bullshit. Well, congratulations. You've drawn the attention of some hostile enemy. Arm yourselves. I think that is totally fine.
That's like the in the dungeon use for, like, in that context is typically referred to as wandering monsters within the dungeon. And then usually in kind of the overworld, like, cross-country travel kind of thing, that's more often referred to as random encounters. But yeah, inside the dungeon, that's part of that board game level thing, is like, how much time do you spend listening at the door to see if you can hear something on the other side? Well, if you decided to spend a turn doing that, you risk another wandering monster roll. Or, how much time do you spend searching for traps before you proceed down the hallway? Well, you're provoking another wandering monster roll. And that's kind of always supposed to be in the back of players' heads, that is what I'm about to do worth risking another monster attack, because you're always under threat when you're in the dungeon. I don't think I've done a good enough job emphasizing that with you guys, largely because you all have, like, been really lucky with with wandering monster rolls, and I haven't, like, tried to crack the whip much, and we're all kind of still getting used to this. But anyway, about the random encounter thing, one more thing I wanted to say about that, Clayton, is that when I do roll my d6 to figure out which day in the travel that's going to occur, I then roll the d6 again, and that represents 4-hour time blocks of when in the day that's going to happen. So, let's say you start at a 1, it will be, just for simplicity's sake, say midnight to 4 a.m. or something. That'll be like the middle watch of the night watch. If I roll a 1, that's when it occurs. Or it might happen on the road, or, who knows what. But it takes care of everything in just, 2 rolls of a d6 and then a percentile roll on the table or whatever it is you're using, and you got your encounter.
So that adds another tool to my toolbox, because the way there have been a few other ways that I've seen how to do random encounters. So just to go over, like, to do how frequently random encounters happen. So first is the method you just said, which would be you decide on a time increment and you roll to see how many time increments happen before the next encounter. I have seen it where, for instance, you have every 3 hours you make a roll, and you roll a d20, for instance, and if it becomes up a 16 to 20, then there is an encounter during that time increment. That's another way I've seen of doing it. I've also seen...
that's so hard on the DM, though.
Yes, it is. That's why I'm switching over to Jordan's method. The last way I've seen of doing it is, like, particularly in a hex crawl, whenever the player characters enter into the next hex, that's when there's a roll to see whether or not there's an encounter and what the encounter might be. So those are 3 methods by which I'm aware to do how frequently random encounters happen.
And I'm totally on board with that. Like, as anybody listening, like, that is 100% a legit good way to do random encounters. I would just challenge you, DMs, to, after it's all done, reflect on that encounter and ask yourself, can I tie this into a greater narrative? Even if it's not like some overall narrative, if it's just back to whatever mini narrative that the players are pursuing at the time. It makes it a lot more, makes the players feel like they've done something meaningful.
So, Jordan, it sounds like on your tables, you just have a group of, like you have a table full of potential random encounters. And then after you've rolled on that, if it's a sentient thing, you might roll on an additional table to tell whether or not it is a hostile or whatever condition or temperament the opposing group, whatever they're encountering, whatever their temperament would be at the time, whether it be hostile, helpful, indifferent, whatever else it might be. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a few rolls that get made. I'm using the first edition monster manual to determine how many things appear of whatever type I've rolled. I then also use the prescribed procedure for determining how far away those things are going to be when they're kind of considered to have spawned, I guess. And it's further during the day and it's closer at night. And I guess that's just kind of like the distance where they have a chance of being aware of you. And then I'm rolling to see if they are aware of the group, if they're close enough that that's, likely. And also rolling secretly if the group is aware of them. And so, once you have all those things set up, it sounds like a lot, but, once you have all that stuff in place, it's actually much less work than the method of like rolling every day and, seeing what happens there. So yeah, I'm concerned with whether or not there's a thing, when that thing arrives, how many of that thing there are, how far away it is from you, whether you see it, whether it sees you, and how it's feeling at the moment. Once you get those factors in place, you've got enough to, if it's something intelligent, you can improvise some motivations and all that. And, certain kinds of things are fairly self-explanatory. You get stupid creatures and they're just hunting for food or whatever. But some things, might not be so clear. And, if you run across especially like the Fae, for instance, they're one of the real tricky ones. Who fucking knows what fairies are going to be up to if you run into them. It could go either way. And, there's lots of weird creatures that are on this list that I would never reach for just if I'm just coming up with it as, my own created encounter off the top of my head, because I forget some of these things even exist. So it shakes things up and it gives players a chance, I think, to experience more of the range of possible encounters that there are to be had out there in the game space.
Jordan, just to give you a heads up in case this happens on your random encounter tables, I will have no problem coming across a helpful troop of orcs, but if we come across a quote helpful group of fae, I am not fucking trusting them.
Oh, buddy, there's sprites and pixies and all sorts of shit floating around out there waiting to mess with y'all.
So we've talked a lot about encountering living things or creatures. Those aren't the only types of things that you can encounter. You can encounter severe weather. You can encounter some sort of environmental hazard. I like to sprinkle these onto my charts of depending on the time of year, if you're keeping track of that sort of thing. Severe weather like a downpour, which if it's in winter, that might not be, that could be freezing rain, or it could be you're in the middle of a fucking blizzard.
I like those so much more than I can't think of the last time that my party got bogged down in a blizzard.
Yeah, it's rough if you're running that type of game and your player characters end up looking down the Donner Party situation.
But man, think about it, drama. That would create so much drama. That's really my only contribution to this episode is random encounters are fine. Encounters on the road are even better. But it has to have drama. It has to have stakes. You know what I mean?
That's part of the reason to track rations, I think, is what if you get in a Donner Party scenario like that? And then also, I think it's interesting that, you've got usually one person is responsible for the navigation rolls. And if they fuck that up and get you guys, 100 miles away from the closest settlement, and you're completely out of food and you're frozen in, who are you going to blame? Who's going to be the first person that you're ready to hit over there with a rock and cook? It's the guy that's been fucking up the navigation rolls that got you here in the first place.
I'm with that.
And more likely than not, the only person who's good enough with the map to potentially find the way out.
Exactly.
But who in the hell would trust him after you got in? Yeah, after he got you in that situation.
Exactly. Drama, baby. That's all I care about.
I've recently redone the how I handle weather, and I do it real simply. I do just a D6 roll, and I do it on the day, and it's just depending on what the type of region it is. If it's more arid or more humid, I'll do a -1 or a -2 or a +1 or a +2 for more humid areas. But basically, the range is like a 1 or less is like calm and sunny. If it's a 2, it'll be like windy and sunny. And then it'll kind of get in towards cloudy, towards overcast. And then like a 6 or more is a storm. And I think that works in no matter what kind of biome you're in. And, or whatever kind of, ecosystem or whatever I'm trying to fumble for here. Environment. Climate. Thank you. But the idea is that the overcast stuff is there to fuck with navigation by starlight at night and like visibility and things like that. That's what the cloudy kind of stuff is about. The calm or windy stuff is about, like sailing and things like that. If it's a storm, that's when you get into something interesting. Could be a blizzard, could be a thunderstorm, a, torrential downpour, or a sandstorm if you're out in the desert. But when I was sitting around thinking about it, those are really the only things that I think people really care about in weather is like, do we have overcast conditions? Are the stars visible or not? What's the wind situation doing? And are things violent enough that it could be potentially dangerous,
Or something that could potentially destroy the road, especially in like mountainous terrain. If something happens that destroys the road and you've got mules or some sort of pack animal and a cart, man, you're going to have to make some decisions because there's no fucking way a cart's going to get through a rocky, like a place where an avalanche has gone through and just completely destroyed the road.
And that is, again, drama. Like, that sounds amazing to me compared to just like, some goblins ambush you. Congratulations, you beat them. Now you continue on.
Yeah, that's a fairly weak encounter there. For inspirational reading, I would recommend anybody that is interested in this kind of stuff look at the first edition AD&D book, The Wilderness Survival Guide. It is absolutely chock full of little subsystems for particular situations like this and how to adjudicate them. And a lot of it is kind of self-contained. Like sometimes it'll reference, player characters' stats or something. Other times it's just like percentile tables. And it's like, okay, we've got a 50-foot sheer cliff face and it's wintertime and this thing's covered in ice and we're trying to climb up it. All right, what's the difficulties? What's going to happen if we, fuck it up? Whatever. It's all kind of like built into it. I'm not saying directly adopt that stuff, but just as like a way to really get yourself cooking on some cool things, it's a cool place to start.
Well, do we have any other burning issues of this topic, or Jordan, do you want me to chalk that up as your first geek thing?
I would be happy to recommend the Wilderness Survival Guide as my geek thing for the week.
This turned into a very productive conversation, though. I don't even think we really spun out all the things we could say, but it's getting a bit long in the tooth.
All right. Jordan, do you have any other geek things that you want to promote?
If you haven't watched it, watch House of the Dragon. That's it. I know that was my one last time, but with every episode, I reaffirm it's fucking great television.
I'll be honest, Lori, my wife, we just walked in, and there's going to be quite a bit of dialogue between her and me that Clayton has to edit out, and I'm very anxious to watch the new episode.
All right. Eliot, do you want to do your geek thing, or do you want me to go ahead?
No, I got one. I've been a little bit disconnected recently, but I have been watching the Taking 20 YouTube channel. Anybody who hasn't watched it should. I'm sure it's been geek thinged in the past. It's just a really great DM. I don't even know his name. He's a great dude. A lot of great advice, especially if you're playing 5th edition. He has a lot of good advice for DMs to make the game a little bit easier to run, who anyone who's running 5th edition probably will appreciate. So go check that out. Taking 20. Good shit.
My geek thing is somewhat related to the topic, although nowhere near as much as Jordan's. Mine is a YouTube channel called Crime Pays, but Botany Doesn't. And this is a botanist out of, he talks with a pretty heavy Chicagoan accent, and he's very colorful in his language, but I think he lives he used to live in California. I think he moved to Texas recently, and he does some really good videos. He travels all over the world, just exploring the different fauna of different environments and giving educational information about them, in a character that is basically a reformed criminal, and it is as fun to listen to as it's as fun to listen to him and his anecdotes that probably didn't really happen as it is to listen to him tell you real things about the plants that he's talking about. And with that, I think we should stop all this bullshit and start rolling some dice, guys.
Let's go.
Sounds good.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.